The killer never made it out of Harlem. That's how the story ends. A man who helped murder Malcolm X found himself surrounded, cornered, with nowhere to run. The crowd closed in. Bumpy Johnson made sure of it. Now here's how it actually happened. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson came to Harlem from South Carolina when he was a boy. People called him Bumpy because of lumps on the back of his head from fights he got into growing up. By the 1930s, he was working for Stephanie St. Clair, the numbers queen who controlled illegal gambling in Harlem. Bumpy learned the streets from her. He learned how power worked in neighborhoods the police didn't care about. He learned that in Harlem, respect mattered more than fear, though he knew how to use both. Through the 1940s and 50s, Bumpy Johnson became the man who ran things in Harlem. He wasn't flashy about it. He wore nice suits, grey and dark blue, always pressed. He walked the streets during the day, ate at the same restaurants, knew people's names. When white mobsters tried to muscle in on Harlem's numbers rackets, Bumpy pushed back. He made it clear that Harlem belonged to the people who lived there. The neighborhood knew him as someone who kept outside threats away. Children saw him hand their mothers money when rent was due. Storekeepers watched him make sure heroin dealers stayed away from schools. He was a criminal, absolutely. He spent years in prison. But in Harlem, the rules were different than they were downtown. Malcolm Little arrived in Harlem in 1946. A young man from Michigan who'd been through foster homes and detention centers and prison. He was tall and thin with reddish-brown hair and sharp features. In prison, he found the Nation of Islam. He found Elijah Muhammad. He changed his name to Malcolm X because the X represented the African name that slavery had stolen from his family. When he got out, he became a minister for the nation. He spoke on street corners in Harlem, his voice cutting through the noise of traffic and sidewalk conversations. People stopped to listen. He didn't talk like other preachers. He didn't beg white people for acceptance. He said black people needed to wake up, stand up, build their own power. By the early 1960s, Malcolm X was the most famous minister in the Nation of Islam. When he spoke at rallies, thousands came. His words made people angry and proud at the same time. He talked about the police brutality that happened every day in black neighborhoods. He talked about the poverty and the drugs and the way the system was designed to keep black people down. White newspapers called him dangerous. White politicians called him a threat. But in Harlem, people lined up to hear him speak at Temple No. 7 on Lenox Avenue. Bumpy Johnson and Malcolm X knew each other for years. They both worked the same streets. They ate at some of the same restaurants. Red Rooster on Lenox. Small places where Harlem's important people gathered. They had conversations. Malcolm respected that Bumpy kept certain kinds of crime out of Harlem. He didn't like that Bumpy was in the numbers racket, but he understood that in a neighborhood where legal jobs barely existed, people did what they had to do. Bumpy respected Malcolm's intelligence and his refusal to back down from anyone. There was a conversation they had sometime in 1963, late at night outside a jazz club on 125th Street. Malcolm talked about how the nation was changing, how Elijah Muhammad was getting old, how there were jealousies and power struggles. Bumpy told him to be careful. He said, when you become more famous than your teacher, people get nervous. Malcolm smiled and said he knew. In 1964, Malcolm X left the Nation of Islam. It happened after he made comments about President Kennedy's assassination that Elijah Muhammad used as an excuse to silence him. But the real reason was deeper. Malcolm had learned that Elijah Muhammad, the man he'd followed for years, had fathered children with young women in the nation. Malcolm felt betrayed. He also saw that the nation wasn't doing enough to fight for civil rights. He wanted action, not just speeches about separation. So he started his own organizations, the Muslim Mosque Incorporated and the Organization of Afro-American Unity. He traveled to Africa and the Middle East. He made the pilgrimage to Mecca. His ideas evolved. He started talking about international human rights, not just American civil rights. He started building alliances with other civil rights leaders, people the nation considered enemies. The Nation of Islam didn't forgive people who left. Malcolm started receiving death threats almost immediately. Nation members called him a traitor. Ministers gave sermons saying hypocrites should be killed. Muhammad Ali, who Malcolm had been close to, turned his back on him. Malcolm told reporters he knew he was a marked man. He told his wife Betty that he probably wouldn't live to see his daughters grow up. On February 14, 1965, 1 week before he died, Someone firebombed his house in Queens while his family slept inside. They barely escaped. Malcom knew who was behind it. Everyone knew. February 21st, 1965 was a cold Sunday afternoon in New York City. The sky was grey. People wore heavy coats and scarves. Malcolm X was scheduled to speak at the Audubon Ballroom on Broadway and 165th Street in Washington Heights, just north of Harlem. The Audubon was a big place, a dance hall that held several hundred people. It had a stage and rows of chairs and balcony seating. Malcolm's security usually checked people at the door, but that day Malcolm told them not to. He said he didn't want people feeling unwelcome. He wanted an open meeting. Around 400 people showed up, men and women and children. Some came to hear Malcolm speak. Some came because they were curious. Some came with other intentions. Malcolm walked onto the stage around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. He wore a dark suit. His wife Betty sat in the front rows with their 4 daughters. Malcolm stepped up to the podium and greeted everyone. He said, "Peace be unto you." The audience said it back. Then, before he could really begin his speech, a disturbance started near the back of the room. 2 men stood up and started arguing loudly. One said to the other, "Get your hand out of my pocket." People turned to look. It was a distraction. Security moved toward the commotion. That's when the shooters stood up. 3 men, maybe more, positioned in different parts of the audience. One had a sawed-off shotgun hidden under his coat. The others had pistols. The man with the shotgun rushed toward the stage and fired. The blast hit Malcolm in the chest. He fell backward. The other gunman started firing. 16 bullets hit Malcolm X's body. People screamed. Mothers grabbed their children and dropped to the floor. Men tried to rush the stage. The ballroom erupted into chaos. Smoke hung in the air. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the smell of fear. Malcolm's bodyguard tried to chase the shooters, but they were already running. 2 of them made it out through the confusion, pushing through the panicked crowd toward the exits. But one of them didn't move fast enough. His name was Talmadge Hayer, though he also went by Thomas Hagen. He was 22 years old. He was from New Jersey. He was a member of the Nation of Islam's Newark Mosque. He shot Malcolm X and then tried to run. He made it to the front entrance of the Audubon. He pushed the doors open and ran outside onto Broadway. He thought he was going to escape into the streets of New York and disappear. But the people who'd been inside the ballroom weren't going to let that happen. They poured out after him. Men who'd watched Malcolm fall ran after the killer with rage in their eyes. Talmadge Hayer ran south on Broadway. He was fast. But Broadway was crowded that Sunday afternoon. People were walking, shopping, standing on corners. Someone tackled him, then someone else. Then more people piled on. They beat him in the street. They wanted to kill him right there. A police officer who'd been directing traffic nearby pulled his gun and pushed through the crowd. He arrested Hayer, probably saving his life. Hayer's leg was broken. His face was bloody. The crowd wanted justice and they'd almost gotten it themselves. Inside the Audubon Ballroom, people tried to save Malcolm. They gave him mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. They begged him to hold on, but he'd been shot too many times. By the time the ambulance arrived and took him to Columbia Presbyterian Hospital, he was already gone. The doctors pronounced Malcolm X dead at 3:30 in the afternoon. He was 39 years old. Word spread through Harlem within minutes. Malcolm X had been killed. Shot down while giving a speech. Murdered in front of his wife and children. The news hit the neighborhood like an explosion. People gathered on street corners. Some cried. Some stood in stunned silence. Some got angry. Radio stations interrupted their programming. By evening, everyone in Harlem knew Malcolm was dead. Bumpy Johnson was at home when he heard. He was in his apartment on Lenox Avenue, the same building where he'd lived for years. Someone called him. Maybe it was one of his people who'd been at the Audubon. Maybe it was someone who heard it on the radio. However the news reached him, Bumpy's reaction was immediate. He stood up from his chair, he put on his coat. He walked out into the Harlem streets on that cold February evening and started making calls, talking to people, asking questions. Who did it? How many of them were there? Did they catch anyone? He learned that the police had one shooter in custody, Talmadge Hayer. But there had been at least 2 others, maybe 3. They'd escaped in the chaos. Bumpy knew how the nation operated. He'd watched them for years. He knew they'd sent a team. He knew this wasn't random. This was an execution. He also knew that in the confusion and panic after a shooting, people scatter in every direction. But they have to go somewhere. They have to leave the scene. And Harlem was Bumpy's territory. Every block, every alley, every basement and rooftop. He'd been running these streets for 30 years. Bumpy Johnson put the word out that night. He talked to his people, the men who worked with him, the people who owed him favours, the shopkeepers and taxi drivers and janitors who saw everything that happened in Harlem. He told them to watch, to listen, to remember faces. If anyone involved in Malcolm's murder tried to move through Harlem, Bumpy wanted to know. This wasn't about revenge in the traditional sense. This was about making sure justice happened. This was about making sure the killers didn't just disappear into the city like nothing had happened. The trap wasn't a single moment. It was a network. Bumpy had built his power in Harlem over decades by knowing people, by creating relationships, by making sure that information flowed to him. In the hours and days after Malcolm's death, that network activated. People on the streets knew to look out for anyone suspicious, anyone who seemed nervous, anyone who matched descriptions of the men who'd fled the Audubon. Harlem became a very difficult place to hide. The police investigation moved slowly. They had Talmadge Hayer in custody, but he wasn't talking. Detectives knew there were other shooters, but identifying them was hard. Witnesses gave conflicting descriptions. Some said one thing, some said another. The Audubon had been crowded and chaotic. People were traumatized. The Nation of Islam denied any involvement. They said Malcolm had enemies everywhere. They suggested he might have been killed by his own people or by the government. The official investigation would take months. But in Harlem, people weren't waiting for official investigations. The community knew who was responsible. The Nation of Islam had killed Malcolm X. Everyone knew it. The only question was which specific members had pulled the triggers. Talmadge Hayer was one. But who were the others? Two names eventually emerged: Norman 3X Butler and Thomas 15X Johnson. Both were members of the nation's Harlem Mosque. Both were known enforcers. Norman Butler was 26 years old, muscular, intimidating. Thomas Johnson was 30, tall, also intimidating. In the days after the assassination, people in Harlem started recognizing them. Someone saw Norman Butler near the hospital where Malcolm died. Someone else saw Thomas Johnson getting on a subway. The word got back to Bumpy. Norman 3X Butler was arrested on February 26, 5 days after Malcolm's death. The police picked him up at his home. Thomas 15X Johnson was arrested on March 3rd. The police found him at his apartment in the Bronx. Both men maintained they were innocent. Both said they weren't at the Audubon that day, but witnesses identified them. The police built their case. Along with Talmadge Hayer, Butler and Johnson were charged with first-degree murder. The question people asked for years afterward was whether the right men were arrested. Talmadge Hayer admitted from the beginning that he was one of the shooters, but he insisted that Norman Butler and Thomas Johnson weren't involved. He said the other shooters were different men from the Newark Mosque, not the Harlem Mosque. He gave their names in court. Nobody listened. The prosecution's case relied on witness testimony that placed Butler and Johnson at the scene. But those witnesses were shaky. Some changed their stories. Some seemed unreliable. Defense lawyers argued that the police wanted to close the case quickly and didn't care if they had the right men. Decades later, in 2021, Norman Butler and Thomas Johnson, who by then had changed their names to Muhammad Aziz and Khalil Islam, were officially exonerated. A new investigation found that the FBI and the New York Police Department had withheld evidence that would have cleared them. Key witnesses had been coerced. Alibis had been ignored. It turned out Talmadge Hayer had been telling the truth all along. Butler and Johnson weren't at the Audubon that day. The real shooters, besides Hayer, were other Nation members who were never prosecuted. They lived their lives and were never held accountable. But in February of 1965, none of that was known yet. What people in Harlem knew was that Malcolm X had been murdered, and that at least one of his killers had been caught trying to escape. Talmadge Hayer had been tackled on Broadway by ordinary citizens who wouldn't let him run. That was Harlem's justice in action. People who loved Malcolm made sure that at least one killer faced consequences. Bumpy Johnson's role in all of this wasn't about physically catching anyone himself. He was 58 years old in 1965. He'd had multiple heart attacks. He wasn't chasing people down streets anymore. What he did was ensure that Harlem stayed vigilant. He made sure that his network was watching. He made sure that if anyone involved in Malcolm's death tried to move through his neighborhood, they would be seen, remembered, reported. He represented the old guard of Harlem. the people who'd been fighting to protect the neighborhood for decades before the civil rights movement became national news, and when Malcom was killed, Bumpy made sure Harlem didn't just accept it quietly. There were stories that circulated in the years after Malcolm's death, stories about Bumpy Johnson confronting Nation of Islam members in the streets, warning them that Harlem wasn't safe for them anymore. Stories about Bumpy making it known that anyone who'd been involved in the assassination needed to leave and not come back. Whether all those stories were true is hard to say, but what's certain is that Bumpy Johnson used his influence to make sure the murder didn't go unanswered. He used his power to support the community's grief and anger. The trial of Talmadge Hayer, Norman Butler, and Thomas Johnson took place in 1966. All three were convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. The prosecution argued they were part of a conspiracy to kill Malcolm X because he'd left the Nation of Islam and become a threat to the organization. The defense argued there wasn't enough evidence, that the witnesses were unreliable, that the real conspirators had gotten away. The jury sided with the prosecution. The three men went to prison. Hayer served 44 years before being paroled. Butler and Johnson served more than 20 years each before being paroled in the 1980s. Then, decades later, after they'd already lived most of their lives, the truth came out and they were exonerated. The assassination of Malcolm X marked a turning point for the civil rights movement and for Harlem itself. Malcolm had represented something different than Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He'd represented black pride, self-defense, international solidarity, a refusal to beg for rights that should have been guaranteed. When he was killed, that voice was silenced at a critical moment. The movement lost one of its most powerful and uncompromising leaders. Harlem lost a son who'd walked its streets and spoken truth in its mosques and ballrooms. Bumpy Johnson died 3 years later, in 1968. He had a heart attack in a restaurant in Harlem. He was 62 years old. By then, the neighborhood was changing. Drugs were flooding in. Heroin was destroying families. The old codes that Bumpy had enforced were breaking down. A new generation was taking over, and they didn't have the same principles. Bumpy Johnson died knowing that the Harlem he'd protected for so long was slipping away. But his actions in the days after Malcolm X's murder mattered. They showed that in a neighborhood where the police couldn't be trusted, and official justice moved slowly if it moved at all, the community had its own ways of responding. When Talmadge Hayer tried to run from the Audubon Ballroom, the people of Harlem ran after him. They caught him. They made sure he couldn't escape. That was justice delivered by ordinary people who refused to let a killer walk free. And behind that response, coordinating and supporting it, was Bumpy Johnson, making sure his network stayed alert, making sure Harlem stayed unified in its grief and its anger. The legacy of that day extends beyond just the assassination itself. It's about what happens when a community loses someone it loves. It's about the difference between official justice and street justice, between what the law does and what people do when the law fails them. Malcolm X's murder was eventually solved in the legal sense. 3 men were convicted, but the real story was more complicated. Some of the men convicted were innocent. Some of the real killers were never caught. The FBI had informants inside the Nation of Islam and may have known the assassination was coming but did nothing to stop it. The New York Police Department reduced Malcolm's security detail in the weeks before his death. There were forces larger than just the Nation of Islam at work, forces that wanted Malcolm X silenced. Bumpy Johnson couldn't fight those larger forces. He couldn't expose FBI conspiracies or change police department policies. He couldn't bring Malcolm back. But he could make sure that in Harlem, on those streets, the people who killed Malcolm X wouldn't just disappear into the crowd. He could make sure that at least one of them was caught, even if that meant the community had to do it themselves. Years after both men died, people in Harlem still told stories about Bumpy Johnson and Malcolm X, about how they knew each other, about the respect between them, about how when Malcolm was killed, Bumpy made sure the neighborhood didn't just grieve passively. Those stories became part of Harlem's history, part of how the community understood itself and its relationship to power and justice. The exoneration of Norman Butler and Thomas Johnson in 2021 reopened old wounds. It confirmed what many people had suspected for decades, that the official story was incomplete and that innocent men had been imprisoned for a crime they didn't commit. It raised new questions about who really killed Malcolm X, and why the authorities had been so quick to convict the wrong people. But it also highlighted something important about that day in February 1965. When Talmadge Hayer ran from the Audubon ballroom, he didn't escape. The community stopped him. That part of the story was true. That part of the justice was real. On that day in Harlem, one man made sure that the neighborhood stayed vigilant and unified in the face of an enormous loss. Bumpy Johnson was many things. He was a criminal who ran illegal gambling operations. He was a man who'd spent years in prison. He was someone who used violence when he thought it was necessary. But he was also someone who loved Harlem and protected it from outside threats. And when Malcolm X was murdered, Bumpy made sure that Harlem responded with strength and solidarity. He made sure that at least one killer faced consequences. He made sure that the community's grief turned into action. And for that, Harlem remembered him, just as it remembered Malcolm X. Two men who walked the same streets, who understood power in different ways, who both refused to let their community be destroyed without fighting back. Their stories are intertwined because they're both part of Harlem's history, part of its pain and its pride and its refusal to be forgotten.